Well, welcome to everyone. We've got an exciting agenda today and plenty of time for questions. So I'm very excited to hear what you have further questions on. So next slide, please. What I'm going to cover off today is a little on the circular economy. Joanne will really slam this one home, but it's important to have a brief overview of what it is, why we need it, and how circular procurement can get us there to the circular economy. Before we jump into that, next slide, please. Where are the pressures coming from? Chris alluded a little to some of the things that you've already been starting some work on sustainability in general. But the pandemic really gave us an opportunity to take a stop and a think and really think about building differently forward. And this is an example from one of the world's largest investment companies called BlackRock. This was his letter to CEOs, but you could argue that it's across the board in terms of who he was targeting. We're looking at transparency, we're looking about action and action now. So why do we have some of the problems we do today? Next slide, please. Today we exist in what's called the linear economy, where we dig stuff out of the ground, we make something with it, we use it, and in some cases, if you think of a plastic stir stick or even a takeout cup of coffee, we're using it for a very short period of time, and then mostly these things get thrown back in a hole in the ground, which you all know about, called a landfill. And we have this idea in Canada that, recycling will fix this problem, but, globally recycling rates are dropping and they're less than 10% to begin with. So recycling is not going to fix the problem. So next slide, please. We really need to think differently. And as I said, the pandemic has given us a fantastic opportunity to start to think differently, reverse that chicken and egg that Chris mentioned. So not only changing our thinking and the way that we collaborate, but much change in product design, and I'll mention a few of these examples as we go forward. But collaboration is really what it's all about. And I know our following speakers are going to talk about this, and hopefully you'll have some questions on it. And then only then, when we've done those three things, do we talk about reverse cycling and doing that take back and recycling piece that Canadians so love. So next slide, please. What does the circular economy really look like? We're trying to break that linear system and make sure that when we build things and make things, we're designing them to be used for as long as possible, keeping them at the highest form of value. And that when eventually, using renewable energy to power them, when eventually they have reached the end of their serviceable life, we will then take them back, and all of those parts get put back into new things, whether it's through recycling or reuse. And people often say, well, that seems very hard, Francis, or whatever. But if you think about it, it's really what our grandparents did. It's nothing complicated or more difficult than that. Our grandparents didn't throw anything away. They made things last. And so if you think of that as, your North Star for the circular economy, you'll be in good shape. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples here of what it might look like, because it's a bit theoretical from that diagram. So let's talk, first of all, about extending product life. And some data is helpful here. In the tech industry, we've done a really good job of making our products to be very energy efficient. So, nearly 80% of the impact of building a PC, an average PC here, is in the manufacturing phase. And hold that thought, because I'm going to talk some more about where the supply chain impacts are. But here you can see, if you're able to give an average PC extra 2 years of life, you can decrease that carbon footprint by 30%. And that's just one example of one small thing. It doesn't mean you have to use it for longer. It could mean you make sure that it gets to a second life in a reuse market as well. Next slide, please. The next thing we'd like to think about is driving product as a service. There's many acronyms for this, everything as a service, DaaS, whatever. Many of you probably are already using managed print as a service. And so you're used to this concept. But maybe you're not thinking of it in terms of what it does in terms of driving the circular economy. If the manufacturer is on the hook for ensuring that product is up and running in the entire time that you have it, they're going to design it to be more reliable and be more repairable and include diagnostics that will enable you to uncover whether something's going to fail. It gets things back to a second life opportunity much faster, and of course encourages manufacturers to think about recyclability and parts recovery, which is even more important, and really fostering these closed loop practices. So here you are, we're talking about accessing the same thing, but instead of buying it as an asset, buying it as a service. And that is one of the biggest things you can do to contribute to the circular economy. And you might be going, well, that doesn't sound logical, Francis. Can you show me some data? Next slide, please. So this is looking at an average computer here, buying it as a service and buying it as a transactional good. This is using LCA lifecycle assessment data. And when we conducted this, we were very surprised that and LCA is the best way we have of comparing two scenarios. And we were really surprised to see that across the board, across all of the impact categories, buying as a service has lower impact. Makes sense when you think about it, but until you actually see the data, it's sometimes a bit confusing. So we talked about product life extension. We've talked about buying as a service. Now let's look at an opportunity of innovation and where innovation is going to take us in a circular economy perspective. Next slide, please. Thinking about the opportunity for spare parts and the role that 3D printers delivering in driving us into a more circular and repair-oriented economy. If we have 3D printers printing out spare parts, we can have an infinite inventory of spare parts ready to repair all those things that we want to do product life extension on. And look at the footprint and weight and cost reduction that you can get through going all the way through to a topological design here for a 3D printed part. So customers like municipalities have the power to catalyze sustainability impact. And often buyers don't feel that they have control or that they can push the market, but you really do. Businesses exist to delight our customers. And if you are asking us to do more on sustainability, we will deliver. Next slide. Here's an example of product life extension. This particular product has no known end of life. It's too big to take back. So it's deliberately designed to be permanently installed and totally field upgradable. And I put this slide up quite often because it's such a novel concept to us in our disposable linear economy that it's quite shocking for people to think that this is actually something you can buy today. And it is. So let's turn now to where the actual impact is. And I mentioned it a little bit. Next slide, please. The actual impact to drive the circular economy better. No one organization can do the circular economy by themselves. It's an economy-wide thing. But when we're thinking about it, and I mentioned that nearly 80% of an average PC's impacts are in the building of its phase. Let's talk supply chain. Next slide, please. So here you can see that there's a whole bunch of issues that are below the surface that we don't typically see when we're only looking at our own operations, whether it's climate change, to plastics, to biodiversity, or species loss, or deforestation. These are all happening in the supply chain. And so we need to be thinking about these things, both from their impact and the way to mitigate them and align with our organizational values. I'm just going to show you the next slide is looking at a major multinational like HP and where our relative carbon footprint is, and just using carbon as a proxy here. Again, you can see it aligns with that, looking at an individual product, where 64% now, it's gone up from 50 to 64% of our impact is in our supply chain. So think about your own buying practices. Where are the impacts for you? And if you're not really thinking about supply chain, you're missing the mark. So I'm just going to show you a quote, next slide, please, that really sinks it home about if we just keep doing things the same way that we've been doing them, we'll continue to reproduce the problems we have of catastrophic climate change, biodiversity loss, but we have the power in our hands to change and innovate the way we buy and what we buy and go from that chicken and egg scenario. So HP's been helping fund some pilots with the broader public sector. Next slide, please. And we've actually been working on a good definition so that people can understand what circular procurement is. And this came from Bob Willard, but it's a work in progress. So what we're looking at, enabling teams to collaborate to get the best value for money, which we always want to do, buying the most sustainable services and goods, and you'll notice I flipped those there because we're talking circular economy here, from the most sustainable suppliers. In a circular economy, no one organization can do it by themselves. We all need to lean in to mitigate these climate and species losses that we're experiencing, in alignment with the organization's stated purpose and strategic goals. And this is the piece that often gets missed the most. Many organizations do not align their purchasing policy to the other broader goals like that they have. And a good example would be, 32 million Canadians live in jurisdictions that have declared a climate emergency. How does that reflect in how those municipalities are buying? It's a good question. Next slide. We actually funded some research to be done on public sector purchasing, all levels of government here across the country. And we have the author on the phone here today, so if you have a specific question, but the high level results were, we looked at bids over $1 million, mostly, in 3 categories. So construction, IT, and large services, which are typical spend categories that most municipalities would have as well. And what we saw, we tried to evaluate how much sustainability was actually in the output document, the RFP document. And you can see here, 78% of them talked about it, but less than half of them were evaluating sustainability in those bids. And if you actually looked at it as an independent consideration in the evaluation, 12%, and none of them, in our opinion, in the researcher's opinion, asked good enough questions to really make a difference from a sustainability standpoint. So the opportunity is pretty huge. Next slide, please. So we've been running this pilot, as I said, with Green Economy Canada, a nonprofit, trying to help broader public sector organizations learn about how to do more sustainable or circular purchasing. And you are getting to see for the very first time, this has not been released data yet, so sneak peek for you guys, there'll be a white paper in the fall. But a couple of things that I thought were important to pull out. Forging new relationships between functional areas and departments. It was not shocking, but the fact that this came out as one of the key things, that procurement, talking to asset management, talking to IT, talking to the sustainability people, and thinking about that Sustainable Development Goal 17 of partnerships for the goals. We're not going to get there as individuals anymore, so we need people who can talk to each other, who want to talk to each other, and are doing that. Getting employee or your colleagues buy-in and support. Making sure that sustainability were scored in the criteria in the procurement process, and of course getting the buy-in and commitment at the most senior level. So these are the very early findings. I'll make sure you get the more fuller white paper in the fall, and I'm sure Chris will get it out to you all. So starting to wrap up here, how do we make it happen? Next slide. So we're doing the first step here today, awareness and knowledge. Joanne is going to tell you some more opportunities that she's got coming up to deepen your knowledge, and some really wonderful events that she's got coming up. Desire and commitment. I don't think any of our stakeholders today would argue against us wanting to do this. So the commitment needs to be there, and dedicating the resources. Many people do this work on the side of their desk, but it's so important. It needs adequate human, financial, and time commitments to get it done. Making sure that we have this management accountability and reinforcement coming from the top. And, if you've got a climate emergency declaration in your municipality, then I would say you've probably got that reinforcement from your city councillors. And of course, absolutely engaging the procurement department in the journey. And Andrea is going to speak to that as we move along. And last slide is just to say thank you, and I'll be sticking around for questions.